Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of YO2A Arsenal Roundup News. I am your host, Richard Espinoza. We are your primary source for Second Amendment news. We report to you important news that matters to most to you, whether it be legislation in the great state of Wyoming, whether it be legislation that will benefit your Second Amendment rights, or it will affect your Second Amendment rights. Wherever it may be in the United States, in all 50 states, it is my job to report it to you and keep you informed. Well, today I'm going to be talking about our new ATF Director. As you may heard yesterday, Kash Patel is officially out as Acting Director of the ATF. He will return to his full-time duties as the FBI Director. President Trump has officially appointed Daniel Driscoll as the new head of the ATF, or the Acting Director of the ATF. So he's temporarily in charge as of right now. I don't know very much about Daniel Driscoll. All I know is that he is the Army Secretary, and from what I understand, he does have a pro-Second Amendment record, or supposedly he does. I don't know, but if you know anything about Daniel Driscoll, just please leave a comment and let me know if you think he's good, if he's bad. Will he do great for our Second Amendment rights? I want to hear from you. But if it was up to me, the ATF should be permanently abolished, because there is no need for the ATF. Really, there isn't. They are a corrupt rogue agency. They've had a long history of corruption. The ATF, started in 1972 under the Richard Nixon administration. And one of the reasons why the Nixon administration started the ATF was to go after the black market industry. The black market industry was making counterfeit guns. In other words, they would sell a firearm that supposedly is a Colt, but it's not a Colt. It's counterfeited with no serial number, and they sell it for a cheap price. They did the same thing with Smith & Wesson. They made it as a counterfeit gun, claiming that it's a Smith & Wesson, and it's not. And there was also some Rugers that were made in Mexico that were counterfeited, and they were sold as original, but they weren't, and it was costing the firearm industry money. And the other purpose was to go after organized crime and drug dealers. However, the ATF would soon abuse its power under the Jimmy Carter administration, and then it would abuse its power under the George H.W. Bush administration. Then it would abuse its power under the Clinton administration, then the Obama administration, and even the Biden administration. If you know the history of the ATF, they've had a long history of corruption. You start with under the George H.W. Bush administration, when the ATF and the FBI violated the rights of Randy Weaver. Now, I'm not saying that Randy Weaver was a good person. Yes, he was a white supremacist, but just because he was a white supremacist doesn't mean you violate his due process. Randy Weaver and his wife and his infant son, I believe it was killed in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, during a standoff. The ATF and the FBI clearly violated his rights without due process. The ATF and the FBI got him to make a sawed-off shotgun. He didn't want to make it for them, but they talked him into it, and they told him nothing bad would happen. He wouldn't get arrested, but they end up throwing him under the bus when he did make it for him. Randy Weber was known to associate with the Aryan Nation. He was known to be a loner. In fact, his whole family were loners. They lived in the middle of nowhere in Ruby Ridge. They homeschooled their kids. They basically wanted to isolate themselves from the public, which is the reason why they lived out in the mountains, to get away from other people. And despite the fact that Randy Weber had white supremacist views, you still don't violate his due process. Same could be said for a left-wing woke lunatic. They have a right to due process. No matter if they're good or bad, everybody has a right to due process, and that's what makes our constitutional republic great. Because under a constitutional republic, we have a due processing system. And yes, we're not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. And there's a big difference between a constitutional republic and a democracy. Under a constitutional republic, you have due process. Under a democracy, it's based on due process. It's based on majority rules. And keep in mind, our founding fathers defeated a democracy known as the King of England. The King of England used a majority rule system. That means you have no representation, no lawyer. It's basically 7 out of 13 votes, and we take away your rights and take away your property. But under our constitutional republic, it's all based on due process, and everything must be based on a unanimous decision. Then we go to the Clinton administration with his corrupt Attorney General, Janet Reno. Janet Reno was a corrupt Attorney General. She was responsible for what happened in Waco, Texas in 1993. And again, I understand that David Koresh was not a good person. Yes, he was a cult leader. He was a child molester. He was a polygamist. He was all these things, but still, you don't violate somebody's due process. We also know who was responsible for the burning down of the compound in Waco, Texas, which was Steven Dinselbach, who was the former ATF director in the Biden administration. He also was also responsible for what happened in Ruby Ridge. And then you go to the Obama administration, where Eric Holder, another corrupt attorney general, was responsible for the life of border agent Brian Terry, who was killed during Operation Fast and Furious. It was the Attorney General, Eric Holder, along with the ATF and the FBI, that got a gun shop owner to sell a high-powered AK-47 that had a device on it. They were trying to track down some drug dealers who were doing human smuggling as well. And that drug dealer, that member of the cartel, used that weapon on Brian Terry and took his life. And the Obama administration covered it up. Eric Holder was forced to testify in front of Congress. He was hammered. He was constantly lying. He wouldn't give a straight answer because he knew he was caught. And then under the Joe Biden administration, the ATF showed its real true colors as an abusive rogue agency. They were making laws without the approval of Congress. And basically the ATF were unelected bureaucrats. And basically they were making laws without the approval of Congress, and Joe Biden used executive orders without the approval of Congress. And of course, Steven Dinselbach was in charge of the ATF, banning pistol braces and the bump stocks without the approval of Congress. Now, to be fair, I will say that President Trump was wrong for making the executive order on banning bump stocks. He should have had the approval of Congress before doing so, but I think he did it because he wanted to get the Democrats off his back and all these anti-gun groups off his back, because he knew he had Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh as his chief justices in the Supreme Court, and he figured that if groups like Second Amendment Foundation, Gun Owners of America, the Firearm Policy, and the National Association for Gun Rights and the NRA would take it to the Supreme Court and it would be overturned. I think that's what Trump wanted it to become, the way he wanted it to lead it to, simply just to get people off his back. Now, the good news is that President Trump is now correcting the wrongs from the past and making things right. We all make mistakes. We all do things we should not have done. And President Trump is no exception to that. Yeah, he made some mistakes. He made some wrong decisions in banning our bump stocks, but he's living up to his mistakes and he wants to make things right. And I believe that he really wants to make things right. So that is why he's cleaning up the mess and the corruption that's going on. So right now I'm going to read you a letter that I have from the National Shooting Sports Foundation on the new ATF director, or the acting ATF director, Daniel Driscoll. And this is what it says. It says, the Firearm Industry Trade Association congratulates acting director of the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, Daniel P. Driscoll, whom President Trump appointed to this position today. In addition to serving as Secretary of Army, acting director Driscoll will oversee the bureau that regulates the lawful firearm industry in the United States. President Trump's decision to appoint acting director Driscoll is indicative of his resolve to bring reform to the ATF and to protect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens and the industry that makes it possible to exercise those rights, said Lawrence G. King, NSSF Senior Vice President and General Counsel. NSSF is deeply appreciative of FBI Director Kash Patel's service to lead the ATF as the acting director for nearly 2 months in his intern role, and the recognition, along with U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi, that the ATF was weaponized by the previous administration to carry out a radical gun control agenda. The firearm industry is confident that President Trump's appointment of acting director Driscoll to lead the ATF will return the Bureau to its purpose role as a law enforcement agency laser force on combating violent crime and illegal firearms trafficking, and the act as a nonpartisan regulation of the firearm industry. NSSF is confident acting director Driscoll will view members of the firearm industry, including licensed retailers, as the ATF partners on the front lines of keeping the firearms out of the wrong hands, combating illegal firearms trafficking, and preventing violent crime involving the misuse of firearms. So hopefully Daniel Driscoll will do a great job, or at least I hope. One thing I can say though is that Kash Patel has done a great job as our FBI director. And he was at the Gun Owners of America's meeting last year at Goals in Knoxville, Tennessee. Goals which is the Gun Owners Advocacy Leadership Summit. He was talking about what people can do to protect their Second Amendment rights. And one of the things that he mentioned, that if he was a member of President Trump's administration, that he was going to restore order and to make sure that our rights are protected and that law-abiding citizens will be left alone, as well as law-abiding gun shop owners. Now, there has been word, and I don't know if this is true, but from what I understand, a possible merger between the ATF and the Food and Drug Administration, meaning that all the ATF agents will be working for the Food and Drug Administration, which would completely abolish the ATF. But the way I see it, that the ATF is not going away anytime soon. As much as I don't like the ATF, they should be abolished, but if they're going to be useful for anything, they should be working on the border, going after the drug cartels, going after the violent gangs, go after the illegal gangs, and leave the law-abiding citizens alone. And one of the things that needs to be done is that we need to abolish the 1968 Gun Control Act, and we also need to abolish the 1934 Machine Gun Act. Those are two unconstitutional laws that should not be infringed upon. These rights infringe upon our constitutional rights. And one of the things that Kash Patel did accomplish during his time as acting ATF director, him and President Trump were able to abolish the no tolerance policy that was written in the Biden administration. If you make one simple mistake, you misspell one word, you end up losing your license and you have to pay all these fines. And it was totally ridiculous and uncalled for. And it was a great thing that Kash Patel and President Trump both abolished the Biden's no tolerance policy. It was totally unconstitutional, and it is now out of play. And the next thing that that Gun Owners of America, as well as the National Association for Gun Rights, the Firearm Policy, the Second Amendment Foundation, and even the NRA, they are working in hopes to abolish the 1968 Gun Control Act, and they also need to abolish, again, the 1934 Machine Gun Act. Now, as I mentioned about the NRA, I know I've had some love-hate relationship with them, even though I was a life member, and I haven't contributed any money because of the incidents with Wayne LaPierre. I believe that Doug Hamlin will possibly do a great job, a far better job in running the NRA than Wayne LaPierre did. And Eric Pratt, the director of Gun Owners of America, has also credited Doug Hamlin as being a staunch defender of the Second Amendment, and he truly believes that Doug Hamlin will turn things around. So both the Gun Control Act of 1968 and the Machine Gun Act of 1934 needs to be abolished, because our Constitution clearly says what it means. Our founding fathers, when they wrote our Constitution, when it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure a free state, that means all of us as American patriots, we are a militia during a time of tyranny. In this case, our founding fathers of the 13 colonies were a militia. They were that militia that started on April 19th, 1775, when they attacked the British on Concord Bridge. We have a right to protect and defend our free state as a militia. And it goes on to say, the right to keep and bear arms shall, the key word is shall not be infringed. Again, shall not be infringed. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And there's a reason why the founding fathers used the term right to keep and bear arms. They didn't use right to bear muskets, right to powder guns, right to single action pistols. They simply said right to keep and bear arms, because the founding fathers knew 250 years after they wrote the Constitution of the United States, they knew eventually in the future that the technology of firearms would change. And the technology of firearms have changed over the years. You go into the 18th century, when it was muskets, when it was black powder guns, when it was black powder pistols, dual pistols. That was part of the 18th century. Then you go into the 19th century, where you had double barrel shotguns, lever action rifles, the Colt single action armies, so on and so forth. Then you go into the 20th century, where semi-auto shotguns were made in the early 1900s under John Browning. And then you had pump action shotguns. And then you had bolt action rifles. Then going into the 1950s, you had the AR-15s under Eugene Stoner's, which is the Armalite rifle. And then you also have the AK-47s during the 20th century, and it carried on all the way into the 21st century. Technology changes. And just because technology changes doesn't mean rights change either. Yes, technology changes, but our constitutional rights never change. It says what it means, and it means what it says. Well, that is it for today for YO2A Arsenal Roundup News. Please subscribe to my channel. If you have some important legislation that you want addressed, whether it be good or bad, whether it will benefit your constitutional rights or will it cause effect on your constitutional rights, send me an email at rjespinoza, that's ESPINOZA, roundupnews@gmail.com. Tell me what state you're from. Tell me what the legislation is about. Tell me if it will either benefit your state or it will cause an effect in your state. Will it protect your Second Amendment rights or will it violate your Second Amendment rights? Whether if it's good or bad, send me an email, send me your name, tell me what state you were from, and I will keep your name anonymous if you want me to. Just say, keep my name anonymous, but just tell me what state you're from and tell me what the legislation is about. Send me a link, and I sure will address it on our next segment. Until then, be safe, be smart, be wise, be armed, be vigilant, protect your family, protect your loved ones, protect your community, because the Second Amendment is all about protecting yourself and defending yourself. It's just not about guns, it's about freedom. And remember, gun control is not about gun control, it's about control and abuse of power. Have a great day, and I will see you then on the next episode of YO2A Arsenal Roundup News.